Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before a temp nurse would save a child's life in 90 seconds with a cardiac needle while 7 specialists watched in stunned silence. Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah smells like antiseptic and institutional failure, fluorescent lights buzzing over laminate floors where Rachel Torres has worked temp nursing shifts for 6 months, always arriving early, always leaving late, her hand steady despite the weight she carries from Tikrit. The hospital corridors stretch like the spine of something dying slowly, beige walls, linoleum that squeaks under regulation shoes, a perpetual hum of machines keeping vigil over people the system has already half forgotten. Rachel moves through these hallways like water finds its level, unnoticed, unremarkable, exactly as planned. She keeps a tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket, rubbing it between her fingers during medication rounds when no one watches. The coin is the size of a quarter, worn smooth by 20 years of hands that learn to hold things gently. One side reads Tikrit 2004. The other reads I owe you everything. Rachel has never let anyone see it. She has never let anyone see much of anything. Her locker in the break room contains no photos, no personal items, no evidence that she exists outside these walls. Only a sealed envelope marked open only if compromised and the Master Chief Petty Officer insignia she hasn't worn in 6 months. The insignia sits in darkness like a promise deferred, like a name she's agreed to forget. Her Naval Intelligence handler checked in exactly once a week, always using the encrypted phone line, always keeping it brief, monitor the Morrison child. Report any deviation. 6 months of reports. 6 months of watching Emma Morrison lose weight like someone was erasing her from the world 1 pound at a time. Emma is 8 years old and dying, though nobody has said it yet. The child came to Cedar Creek with a referral for failure to thrive and persistent weight loss, clinical language that translated to something simpler, a mother in dress white standing in the hallway at 2,300 hours, arms crossed, jaw locked the way Navy families learn to hold themselves when they cannot control the outcome. Commander Blake Morrison. That name meant something to Rachel, meant everything, actually. It meant Tikrit. It meant a dusty street in 2004 where a young lieutenant took shrapnel meant for his team and stopped breathing, and a 24-year-old hospital corpsman had carried him for kilometers through enemy territory with a collapsed lung and a prayer that tasted like copper and sand. That lieutenant had lived. That lieutenant had a daughter. Emma Morrison has lost 12 pounds in 4 months. Rachel checks her vitals 3 times per shift, documenting the weight loss trajectory in the margins of her own mind, a curve that accelerates, that suggests something systemic, something the tests keep missing. Height 50 inches. Weight now 58 pounds. Should be 70. 12 pounds is a child's arm, a child's leg, a child's entire future being subtracted from the present. 7 doctors have examined Emma Morrison over 4 months. Dr. Whitfield paraded each specialist through like trophies, standing at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed, offering his opinions as if they were scripture. Pediatric gastroenterology ruled out malabsorption. Pediatric endocrinology ruled out metabolic disorder. Infectious disease ruled out chronic infection. Each specialist left with their ruling and their certainty, and Emma kept losing weight like someone was slowly turning down the volume on her life. Rachel recognized what all of them had missed because she had seen it before, not in a hospital, but in a field tent in Tikrit, in a child whose parents had lost everything and who was dying from something that looked like starvation but was really cardiac dysfunction. Pericardial effusion. Fluid around the heart, restricting it, making each beat smaller and less efficient until the body began consuming itself just to survive. That child's name had been Amira. Rachel had carried her 3 miles through enemy territory, Amira's weight like a prayer against her chest, and found a field hospital that could drain the fluid and save her life. That child's grateful parents had eventually made it to America. They had built a life in San Diego. Their daughter had grown up to become Commander Blake Morrison. Rachel understood, in that moment, the architecture of fate, that the universe occasionally collapses probability and decides to show you exactly why you were supposed to survive, why you were supposed to be trained in this way, why your hands had learned to be steady. Emma Morrison was dying from the same thing that had nearly killed her mother, and 7 specialists had missed it because they were looking for common diseases in a common hospital in a common afternoon. Rachel had said nothing. Her job was to watch. Her job was to remain invisible. Her Naval Intelligence handler was building a case against Whitfield for insurance fraud, a conspiracy involving misdiagnosis of military families, inflated treatment costs, kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies to his private practice. The case would take time. The case would require patience. Emma was dying. Patience was not an option. At 0800 sharp, Dr. Whitfield entered the pediatric wing with his white coat pressed to surgical perfection, his authority absolute, his movements the kind of controlled precision that comes from knowing nobody will ever challenge you. He was tall in the way men learn to be tall when their fathers were tall, when every woman in their lives has confirmed their importance by shrinking slightly in their presence. His smile, when it appeared, was the smile of someone who had never experienced the corrective feedback of actual consequence. Rachel was restocking the medication cart when she heard him call out to Emma, his voice pitched high in the way men use when they're performing kindness for an audience. "How's our little fighter doing today, Emma? Still having trouble keeping food down?" Emma didn't answer. Emma rarely answered anyone anymore. The exhaustion of being sick had taught her the economy of speech. Why waste energy on words when silence was more honest? Rachel continued pulling vials, her hands moving with a kind of automatic precision that comes from muscle memory. Atropine. Saline. Dopamine. The same medications, the same routine, the same invisible labor that held the hospital together while doctors made decisions. She didn't flinch when she heard him say it. She didn't change the tempo of her work or betray any awareness that he was now moving toward the cafeteria, that he was about to encounter the remainder of the morning in a way that would demand a response. But that wasn't the worst part. The cafeteria at Cedar Creek smells like industrial cooking oil and something darker underneath, the smell of meals made without care, consumed without joy, digested without gratitude. Rachel had taken her lunch at 1,200 hours exactly, a habit born from precision, always eating at the same time, always at the same table in the corner where she could see the entire room. Roasted chicken sandwich. Apple. Black coffee. No substitutions. No variations. The meal of someone who understood that food was fuel and nothing more. Whitfield entered with his entourage, 2 younger physicians, residents probably, the kind of men still learning how to take up space in the world. He was holding forth about something, his voice carrying the particular timbre of someone accustomed to being the loudest person in any room. He was talking about the temp, Rachel understood, because his eyes found her for just an instant before he looked away with that smile, the one that meant someone was about to become smaller. "I give her a week," he said loudly, and the residents laughed with a desperate urgency of men trying to confirm their membership in a club they feared they might be rejected from. These agency nurses, they can't handle the pressure. They're not built for it. Rachel didn't look up from her sandwich. He moved closer, and she could smell his cologne, expensive, aggressive, the kind of scent designed to announce arrival before the voice caught up. His tray passed directly over her table, deliberately, and then descended with the kind of calculated gentleness that made the action worse. His hand was steady. His expression was pleasant. His words, when they came, were pitched for the room rather than for her. "Excuse me, sweetheart." She was putting her fork down when his tray tipped. Not dramatically. Not with obvious force. Just a subtle shift of balance, the way someone might accidentally catch a corner on a water glass, except there was no water glass. There was only intention wearing the mask of accident. Her lunch scattered across the floor like shrapnel. The apple rolled under a table. The sandwich folded in half. The coffee mug shattered with a sound like small bones breaking. Rachel felt the warmth of it spreading across her shoes, smelled the bitter dark of it mixing with the antiseptic undertones of her own scrubs. The cafeteria went quiet. Not the quiet of respect. The quiet of recognition, the quiet of people understanding that they had just witnessed a boundary being crossed and that the boundary crosser held the institutional authority to justify it. Rachel stayed very still. She had learned stillness in Tikrit, where movement meant death, where breath itself had to be negotiated with the universe. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint. 20 years of training was pushing against her skin like something alive, demanding response, demanding action, demanding that she remind this man exactly how fragile his authority actually was. She could see the exact technique, the wrist angle, the force vector, the moment of follow-through. She could execute it without leaving bruises. She could do it in a way that would look like an accident. But she didn't move. Whitfield dropped something else, Emma's chart, from under his arm, letting it fall with a deliberate slowness that made the impact worse. Paper scattered across the tile. His eyes were bright with the particular joy of a man testing boundaries he believed were unbreakable. "Pick that up, sweetheart. And maybe next time you'll be more careful where you're sitting." Rachel picked up the papers. One by one. 7 doctors' notes. 6 months of test results. For months of weight loss documented in precise clinical language that translated to a child dying slowly while specialists offered increasingly elaborate theories about why. She stacked them in order, chronological, methodical, and when she straightened, her eyes met his for exactly 1 second. Long enough for him to see that she had not broken. Long enough for him to understand that his power meant nothing to her. Then she walked to the supply closet. The closet was small and dark and filled with the smell of bleach and something chemical underneath. Rachel locked the door and gripped the tarnished challenge coin until her fingers ached. The coin bit into her palm like a question. What are you doing here? What are you waiting for? What good is survival if you don't use it to save someone? She had survived Tikrit to become invisible. She had trained for 20 years to serve silently. Her entire existence was predicated on a mission that required her to remain unseen, undocumented, officially invisible. The case against Whitfield was 3 months from completion. 3 months from arrest. 3 months from a prosecutor's office that had been building fraud charges so comprehensive that Whitfield would spend 10 years in federal prison. 3 months from the moment Emma Morrison would be dead. Rachel opened her palm and stared at the coin. Commander Blake Morrison's face was younger in her memory, 23 years old, bleeding out in a street in Tikrit, asking her to kill him rather than let him slow her down. She had carried him anyway. She had carried him for kilometers with a collapsed lung and refused to stop, and now his daughter was disappearing weight by weight while the system designed to protect her moved with bureaucratic precision toward justice. The fluorescent light above the closet buzzed. A single insect beat itself against the bulb, tiny and desperate, trying to reach something that would burn it. Rachel understood the metaphor. She closed her hand around the coin and gripped it until the metal warmed against her skin, until the sharp edges pressed half-moons into her palm. Her composure was a muscle, one she had developed over decades, one that was stronger than most people's entire bodies. But muscles could be overridden. Discipline could break. And sometimes the most dangerous moment came not when you acted, but when you forced yourself not to. She remained in the supply closet for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Nobody came looking for her. Nobody checked. She was the temp. The invisible one. The person everyone assumed would leave at the end of her shift and not return. When she came out, her shoes were still wet with coffee. Her scrubs were still marked with the physical evidence of humiliation. And her jaw was clenched so tight it felt like it might never unlock again. But when she returned to the pediatric ward, when she approached Emma Morrison's room, her hands were perfectly steady. Emma was asleep, her breathing shallow, her ribs visible beneath hospital-grade cotton. Rachel checked the monitoring equipment. Studied the chart. Reviewed the test results one more time, the way 7 doctors had reviewed them before her. She knew what they had missed. She had always known. And now she had to decide whether her mission was more important than the child's life. The nurse's station smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic when Dr. Whitfield announced his bet at 0830. Rachel was entering Emma Morrison's latest vitals into the computer, heart rate elevated again, weight down another 0.4 pounds since Tuesday, when his voice carried across the floor like a tank idling in a garage, thick with authority and contempt. "I'm giving the temp here 1 week before she quits," he said, loud enough for the morning shift to hear. Three nurses laughed. One shifted uncomfortably, eyes flicking toward Rachel. Anyone want to take that action? $5 says she's gone by Friday. Rachel's fingers never paused on the keyboard. She continued typing, O2 sat 94, respiratory rate 22, the kind of breathing pattern that meant a child's lungs were working too hard to move air, while Whitfield walked to the whiteboard and wrote 7 days in block letters next to her name. He circled it twice. The marker squeaked against the board like something small being crushed. Someone needs to show Temp how we do things at Cedar Creek, he announced, and the way he said her nickname transformed it into something less than a name. Less than a person. Rachel nodded once. Yes, Doctor. Her voice came out steady, deferential, the voice of a woman with nothing hiding underneath. 20 years of extracting wounded SEALs from Tikrit firefights had taught her that the quietest response was the most dangerous one. Whitfield expected trembling. Submission. What she gave him was silence, and his jaw tightened slightly when she didn't provide the satisfaction of visible frustration. The cafeteria incident unfolded at noon with the precision of a choreographed humiliation. Rachel carried her tray past Whitfield's table. She'd calculated the exact route that would place her within his reach, because understanding your enemy's movements was foundational to any operation, when his hand accidentally knocked the edge of her plate. The tray tilted. Soup spilled across the tile in a spreading arc of crimson, the sandwich skidded under the chairs of 3 residents, and a plastic water cup clattered against the floor like a bell announcing the moment. "Oh, did I do that?" Whitfield asked, his voice pitched for the gathered staff to hear. His colleagues laughed, the sound of jackals that didn't understand they were being watched by something far more dangerous than they could comprehend. Better clean that up before someone slips. Temp wouldn't want an accident on your shift. Rachel knelt on the tile without hesitation. Her movements were precise, military efficient, the same economy of motion that had packed field dressings onto open wounds under fire. She wiped the soup with cafeteria napkins, gathered the scattered food, and worked with her hands moving while conversations resumed above her head. Someone made a joke about temps. Someone else laughed. Rachel became invisible, which was exactly the point. But that wasn't the worst part. The chart throwing happened at 1,400 during rounds when the attending physicians rotated through Emma's case for what felt like the 100th time. Rachel had documented all 7 specialists over the past 4 months: cardiologist who ordered an EKG, gastroenterologist who blamed malabsorption, pediatric oncologist who suggested lymphoma, infectious disease specialist who tested for TB, rheumatologist screening for autoimmune markers, endocrinologist measuring thyroid function, and a hematologist who concluded failure to thrive without a specific diagnosis. 7 doctors, each one parading through like trophies in Whitfield's collection of authority, each one missing the same constellation of signs that Rachel had recognized the moment she first touched Emma's neck and felt the jugular vein distension. During rounds, Rachel followed protocol. She stayed 1 step behind, held the chart when asked, recorded vitals when directed. But when Whitfield examined Emma at 13:47 and documented continued weight loss, likely psychosomatic, monitor and reassess, Rachel spoke quietly in the hallway afterward, keeping her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Dr. Whitfield, her superior vena cava presentation suggests pericardial involvement. The facial edema and..." He moved before she finished the sentence. His hand shot out and grabbed the chart from her hands, then hurled it at her feet with the kind of precision that suggested he'd practiced the move in his mind 1,000 times. Papers exploded across the linoleum, lab results, imaging reports, vital signs trending downward in red ink, and scattered in a radius around her knees. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice cold enough to frost glass. The medical team froze. A resident's hand stopped halfway to a coffee cup. A student nurse looked at the floor. Whitfield's presence had the terrifying fluid precision of a predator, and when he spoke again, his words were for the entire hallway to hear. "And when you're done playing nurse, the real doctors will handle the diagnosis. You're here to follow orders, not ask questions. Understood?" Rachel bent to retrieve each page. She worked methodically, collating them back into order, lab reports first, then imaging, then the medication list Whitfield had written. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her face was a mask. But in the supply closet 30 seconds later, alone between shelves of sterile gloves and 4-packs, she gripped the tarnished military challenge coin she kept in her scrub pocket until her knuckles turned white. The coin was thin, worn on both sides from decades of being carried, with SEAL Team 3 etched into one face and a date, June 15, 2004, on the back. Commander Blake Morrison had pressed it into Rachel's hand in a Tikrit Field hospital while her shoulder was being stitched, and he'd said the words that still echoed 20 years later, "I owe you everything." The hidden earpiece in her left ear crackled. Her Naval Intelligence handler's voice came through, calm and professional and utterly indifferent to the situation unfolding in the hospital. 6 more weeks minimum, Torres. We need the insurance fraud documentation. Hospital board meeting is February 14th. Hold position. Rachel's jaw tightened. She understood the operational calculus. Whitfield had been systematically misdiagnosing military family members for 4 months, and the handler was building a case that traced insurance claims back to kickback schemes with pharmaceutical vendors. Whitfield was the visible crime, but there were others, administrators who signed off on his diagnoses, pharmaceutical representatives who benefited from unnecessary testing, board members who looked the other way. The conspiracy was larger than one arrogant pediatrician. The case required evidence, documentation, and Rachel maintaining her cover as an invisible temp nurse that Whitfield had already begun counting down the days to remove. She opened her hand and looked at the challenge coin. Commander Morrison's daughter was dying on the 3rd floor. 7 doctors had failed her. And the operation that could destroy the entire conspiracy required Rachel to watch the girl decline for 6 more weeks. The next morning, Emma Morrison arrived at rounds with her mother walking beside her, Commander Morrison in civilian clothes, worried lines etched around her eyes. Emma's gait had changed. Her movements were slower, more labored, the kind of decline that happened when a child's heart couldn't push blood against the pressure of fluid surrounding it. Rachel watched from the vital signs station and recorded the numbers that no one else seemed to see the pattern in: oxygen saturation 93, heart rate 127, respiratory rate 24, blood pressure 98/58. The girl was in compensatory shock. Whitfield breezed through at 14:30 with his usual entourage, barely examining Emma, already moving to the next patient. He noted the stable, continue current management in the chart and left. Rachel stood in the hallway afterward, fighting the precision instinct that had kept her alive through 147 combat saves. The handler's voice was steady in her ear: "Stand down. We need 6 more weeks." "That's an order." Rachel had never disobeyed an order in her entire military career. She had never prioritized a mission over the life in front of her. She had survived Tikrit, Fallujah, Sanjin Valley, and 3 tours in provinces where the word mercy was a luxury that couldn't be afforded. She had learned that composure under pressure was the difference between a hero and a headline. But Emma Morrison's eyes had looked at her the same way that child's mother had looked at her in 2004, just before Rachel lifted the girl into her arms and ran 3 miles through enemy territory toward a field hospital that might not exist. The room went dead silent in Rachel's mind when she realized what she was going to do. Emma Morrison's eyes rolled back at 6:27 a.m. on a Tuesday that had started like every other Tuesday for the past 127 days. Rachel caught her before she hit the floor. The cardiac monitor shrieked, a sound like metal scraping metal, and the numbers climbed in real time. Heart rate 140. 160, 180. The child's skin had gone the color of wet newspaper, lips taking on the distinctive blue tint that meant the heart couldn't push blood forward anymore. Rachel's hands moved before her brain caught up, muscle memory from 20 years of field medicine overriding the careful nurse persona she'd perfected. She lowered Emma onto her back, fingers already assessing the venous distension in the child's neck, the muffled heart sound she'd been tracking for weeks while 7 different doctors had looked at the same child and seen only what Dr. Whitfield told them to see. Superior vena cava syndrome. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid around Emma's heart had been slowly suffocating her all along, and nobody had looked close enough to notice because they were too busy listening to a man in a white coat who had a reputation to protect. The resident, some third year named Patterson, who'd been shadowing Whitfield all month, stood frozen with his coffee cup still in his hand. "What are you? You can't just..." Rachel was already moving toward the crash cart, her voice dropping into the register she used in Afghan field hospitals when the rota wash of incoming Blackhawks meant triage decisions had to happen in seconds. "Get Dr. Whitfield. Tell him his patient has pericardial effusion compressing the right atrium. Do it now." Patterson didn't move. "It's not a request." Rachel had the cardiac needle in her hand, the 18-gauge spinal needle designed for exactly this procedure, the one she'd performed 4 times in 2007 outside Fallujah when a convoy had taken shrapnel and the medic had taken shrapnel worse. She positioned Emma supine, the child's small chest exposed, ribs visible enough that Rachel could count them without guessing. The monitor screamed its warning, O2 sat dropping, 89, 87, 84, and there was no time for permissions or protocols or waiting for a cardiologist who might show up in 10 minutes. Rachel's hands were steady as surgical steel. She found the subxiphoid approach, the safest entry point, below the xiphoid process where the needle could slide beneath the pericardium without catching lung or myocardium. Her fingers mapped Emma's anatomy the way they'd mapped 100 wounded bodies in places where medicine happened at gunpoint. She prepped the skin with an alcohol swab, and the smell of it, sharp and chemical, nothing like the copper and diesel reek of a combat triage unit but close enough to trigger the same muscle memory, flooded her nervous system with practiced calm. The needle went in at a 30-degree angle toward Emma's left shoulder, advancing slowly, feeling for the give that would signal penetration. Rachel's jaw clenched once, a single moment of tension, and then her face returned to the flat professional composure of someone who had done this procedure under mortar fire and didn't flinch. The needle advanced. Tissue resistance, slight push, then the characteristic give as the needle penetrated the pericardium. Rachel felt it the way a surgeon feels everything in their hands, not with fingers but with something deeper, something that came from having saved or lost limbs based on feel alone. She aspirated slowly. The fluid came back straw-colored, slightly blood-tinged, and with each cc she withdrew, Emma's oxygen saturation climbed. 50 cubic centimeters of fluid. The O2 sat ticked up to 88. 100 cubic centimeters drawn, and the heart rate began to drop from its panicked 180 toward something almost normal. Rachel could hear the monitor's rhythm becoming more organized, electrical alternans resolving, the alternating electrical amplitude that meant the heart had been drowning in its own fluid cage finally beginning to breathe. 200 cubic centimeters total drainage. 90 seconds from collapse to stabilization. The moment she withdrew the needle and applied direct pressure, Emma's oxygen saturation read 94%. Her heart rate stabilized at 110, tachycardic still but no longer in that lethal spiral. Color returned to the child's face like a photograph developing in solution, the blue fading from her lips, her chest rising and falling with the kind of easy rhythm that meant the pericardial tamponade had released its stranglehold. "Now call Dr. Whitfield," Rachel said to Patterson, her voice quiet enough that only the resident could hear it. "Tell him his patient has cardiac tamponade secondary to a mediastinal mass. She needs oncology, not another gastroenterology consult. Tell him his 7 specialists missed lymphoma because they weren't looking." Patterson's phone was already in his hand, but his eyes hadn't left Emma's face. "How did you move?" Rachel said, and there was nothing gentle in it. The code team arrived in under 90 seconds, the attending cardiologist rushing through the doors with his team, finding a child who had been moments from cardiac arrest now stable and breathing with color in her cheeks. He looked from the monitor to Emma to Rachel standing beside the bed with the cardiac needle still in her gloved hand, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe. Or the understanding that whatever had just happened, it had saved this child's life in a way that 6 months of misdirected specialists never could have. Rachel stepped back. Protocol said she should hand off, brief the cardiologist, document the procedure in the chart with her carefully printed nurse's notes that never quite said what her hands had done. Protocol said she should accept the invisible place she'd carved out here, the temp nurse that nobody looked at twice, the one Dr. Whitfield had made a point of dismissing in front of the entire hospital cafeteria 2 months ago. But that wasn't what happened next. The doors to the pediatric ICU burst open with enough force that the hinges groaned, and Dr. Whitfield strode through with his face the color of a cardiac arrest monitor, his mouth opening before his brain could catch up. Patterson had called him. Of course Patterson had called him, the resident terrified of the man who signed his evaluations, who controlled his future, who had made it clear that questioning the attending physician's decisions was a career-limiting move. Who authorized this procedure? Whitfield's voice carried the kind of volume that turned every head in the unit, nurses frozen mid-step, doctors stopping mid-sentence. Who told you to touch my patient? Rachel was putting the needle into the sharps container, removing her gloves with deliberate care, compartmentalizing the 9 seconds of rage that wanted to surface behind her teeth. Her voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only Whitfield could hear it clearly, though the unit had gone so silent that every word carried. Your patient was in cardiac tamponade. Her pericardial effusion had compressed the right atrium. She was dying. I didn't authorize, you don't have the standing to. Whitfield's hands had balled into fists at his sides, the veins in his neck standing out like somebody had drawn them in marker. He was looking at Rachel the way a man looks at something that has just destroyed his narrative, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't medical concern. It was fear. You've violated about 17 protocols, and I'm calling hospital administration right now. You're finished here. But Emma's oxygen saturation was 96% and climbing. Her heart rate was 108, steady, no longer in distress. The lymphoma would still kill her if nobody treated it, but the immediate suffocation would not. The pericardial effusion that 7 specialists had missed while they followed Whitfield's misdirection had been drained by hands that had done the same procedure in a field hospital outside Tikrit, hands that belonged to someone who had carried a child through 3 miles of hostile territory once before because that child's mother had looked at her the way Emma's mother would look at her when she found out her daughter had been 90 seconds away from cardiac arrest. Rachel pulled off her second glove and met Dr. Whitfield's eyes for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for him to see that she wasn't frightened, that she had known exactly what the cost of saving this child would be, and that she had made her choice anyway. She'll need oncology, Rachel said, turning back to Emma. Not cardiology. Not gastroenterology. Oncology. Because she has a mediastinal lymphoma, which is what's been causing the pericardial effusion all along. That's what 7 doctors missed while they were following your workup. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and somewhere in the distance, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Dr. Whitfield stood frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through emotions, rage, then understanding, then calculation, and Rachel knew in that moment that her surveillance mission had just become a liability. Her Naval Intelligence handler would be furious. 6 more weeks of documentation, the conspiracy around the insurance fraud scheme he'd been building a case against, and Rachel had just blown it open by saving a child instead of staying invisible. But Emma was breathing. The challenge coin in Rachel's pocket felt heavier than it had this morning, as if saving the daughter had added weight to the object that connected her to the father she'd saved 20 years ago. She touched it once through the fabric of her scrubs, a single moment of contact, and prepared herself for what would come next. What happened next would end careers. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Rachel already knew exactly what Dr. Whitfield would do, because she'd seen this pattern before in 12 years of watching powerful men protect themselves instead of their patients. He wouldn't accept responsibility. He wouldn't recommend oncology consult. He would instead move to eliminate the witness who had made him look incompetent in front of his entire department. Rachel turned away from Emma's bed and found Dr. Whitfield's eyes still on her, and in that look was the promise of everything he was about to do. Dr. Whitfield entered Emma's room at 11:47, and his first words weren't about the child breathing steadily with normal vitals, they were about authority. Who authorized that procedure? His voice moved like a blade across still water, cutting through the monitor's steady beeping. The resident stammered something about the emergency, the collapse, the need for immediate intervention. Whitfield silenced him with a look. She practiced beyond her scope. Not a question. A pronouncement. The kind of statement that turns a room's air pressure dense and unbreakable. Rachel stood at the foot of Emma's bed, her hands perfectly steady. The child slept with an oxygen mask that barely fogged anymore, her superior vena cava finally decompressed, the pericardial effusion drained clean. 198 milliliters gone in 90 seconds. But Whitfield looked at Emma the way a territorial predator surveys disputed territory, not with relief, not with medical interest, but with calculation. What Rachel had done wasn't life-saving in his equation. It was insubordination. It was a threat to the narrative he'd spent for months constructing with 7 different specialists paraded through like trophies, each one deferring to his authority while he steered them toward his predetermined conclusions. "Get out," Whitfield said to Rachel. Not shouted. Never that. His tone carried the kind of quiet certainty that comes from knowing the institution bends when you pull the right strings. Rachel nodded once and moved past him through the doorway. As she passed, his hand gripped her arm, not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to make the point. His fingers felt like surgical clamps. "This isn't over." She didn't respond. Couldn't. Not without revealing the 17 years of hand-to-hand training that would have put him on his back in 3 seconds. Not without showing him the thing she'd learned in Tikrit, that restraint isn't weakness when you're holding back an apex predator's worth of force. Rachel pulled her arm free with deliberate calm and kept walking. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Within the hour, Whitfield activated his network like a man playing a phone tree he'd memorized decades ago. First call, the hospital board president, his medical school roommate at Johns Hopkins, a man whose son worked in Whitfield's department and owed his career to the chief's recommendations. Liability concern, Whitfield said into his office phone. Patient safety protocols. The temp nurse performed an emergency procedure beyond her scope of practice. I need documentation in the system immediately. By 12:15, Whitfield had called 2 state licensing investigators, mentioning fraud, mentioning unauthorized practice, mentioning a pattern of dangerous decision-making. His voice on those calls carried absolute authority, the tone of a man who'd never been questioned by anyone who mattered. The fabricated documentation appeared in Rachel's personnel file like a virus replicating through a clean system. 3 violations. All backdated. All with timestamps that would prove, if anyone bothered to verify, that they'd been entered at 0200 that morning from Whitfield's office computer, but nobody would verify, because the state investigators would be looking at a preponderance of evidence, not forensic details. Whitfield was competent at destruction. He understood how institutions protected their own. He understood that a temp nurse from an agency, a woman with no union representation, no tenure, no visibility, represented a problem that solved itself if handled correctly. Rachel's earpiece crackled at 13:12. Her handler's voice carried the particular tension that comes from watching a mission collapse in real time. Torres, stand down. Do not defend yourself. Do not reveal your credentials. Do not contact any hospital personnel. We're 42 days from having sufficient evidence on the insurance fraud scheme. If you expose your position now, Whitfield walks. The entire investigation fails. The voice in her ear, handler James, whom she'd worked with for 8 years through 2 deployments and a classified extraction in Yemen, sounded like he was reading a script someone else had written. Because he was. Because this had gone past his authority the moment an 8-year-old nearly died. Rachel sat in the break room with a cold cup of coffee she didn't drink, watching Emma's mother, Commander Blake Morrison, still wearing her dress uniform from morning debriefs, moving toward the pediatric oncology wing. The girl followed behind her, holding her mother's hand, finally about to receive a diagnosis that would save her life. A lymphoma diagnosis. Treatable. Survivable. The kind of truth that had been locked behind Whitfield's fog of misdiagnosis for 4 months while the man played God with a child's mortality the way other men played golf. Emma looked back once as they turned the corner, and her eyes found Rachel's through the break room's small window. The child didn't understand yet. She would, eventually. Everyone did, eventually. At 1600, Whitfield summoned Rachel to his office with hospital security present. The security officer was a young man, probably 5 years out of active duty, the kind of face that still carried the muscle memory of following orders. He stood with his hands clasped, avoiding eye contact. Whitfield sat behind his mahogany desk like a judge, the forged personnel file spread open before him with the theatrical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. His hands moved with surgeon's grace as he slid the termination papers across the desk. The paper whispered across the wood. Effective immediately. You'll surrender your access badge and leave the premises. Hospital security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Whitfield's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd neutralized a threat without raising his voice. Your agency will receive formal documentation of the protocol violations. You won't work another shift in this state. Rachel looked at the papers without touching them. Looked at her name printed in Whitfield's careful handwriting. Looked at the 3 violations he'd constructed like a building made of shadows. She reached into her scrub pocket and placed her badge on the desk, the temporary ID that had been her only passport for 6 months, the plastic rectangle that had let her move through Cedar Creek Medical's corridors while her real identity stayed locked in a Naval Intelligence vault. The badge slid across the desk without a sound. I understand, Rachel said. 8 words. Soft. The voice of a temp nurse who understood her place, who accepted the hierarchy, who knew better than to fight. The mask stayed on. The Marine's calm held steady. The Master Chief's awareness of tactical disadvantage kept her silent. The security officer escorted her to the employee locker room with the awkward formality of someone following a checklist nobody wanted to be executing. Rachel removed her personal items, a photograph of her brother in dress uniform, a small bottle of pain relief balm, the tarnished challenge coin that Commander Morrison had given her 23 years ago, the one that had her call sign engraved on the back, Phantom. I owe you everything. She turned it over in her hand once, feeling the weight of 2 decades, then slipped it into her jacket pocket where it had lived since 2004. She moved through the hallways one final time, heading toward the basement laundry room where the hospital's worn scrubs got cycled through industrial washers that ran on a schedule older than Rachel's commission. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like 1,000 insects. The air smelled like bleach and detergent and the particular staleness of spaces meant for invisible workers. Rachel pulled her final shift scrubs from the bin, the set she'd worn during the pericardiocentesis, still holding the faint warmth of her hands, of her movements, of 90 seconds when she'd stepped outside the persona and become what she actually was. She folded them with military precision. Corner to corner. Crease to crease. The way she'd folded her brother's dress uniform the day the casualty officer came to the door with his sunglasses on. The way she'd folded countless things across 17 years of service, flags, bandages, the evidence of lives salvaged from moments when everything collapsed. Each fold was exact. The fabric still warm. The steam rising in wisps that disappeared into the recycled air. Her earpiece crackled again. Handler James's voice came through clearer this time, but no gentler. Torres, we have you at Cedar Creek. Confirm status. Terminated, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. 42 days, you said. 42 days to evidence admissible in court. Which means Whitfield remains in position. Which means the pattern continues. Which means other families. Other children. The handler let that settle. I know. Stand down anyway. Rachel placed the folded scrubs on the laundry bin's edge and turned toward the service exit. The basement corridor stretched toward afternoon light, a single door that led to the parking lot, the city, a life that had reverted to anonymity. A temp nurse who'd failed to prevent a child from becoming another statistic in Whitfield's invisible war against the families of military personnel who trusted his hospital with their lives. She pushed through the service door at 16:45, and the Savannah heat hit like a physical thing, dense and wet and unforgiving, the kind of Georgia afternoon that made the asphalt shimmer with heat that looked like water from a distance. Behind her, Cedar Creek Medical's brick walls held the child she'd saved but couldn't protect. Held the man she'd exposed but couldn't stop. Held 42 days of evidence gathering while a predator remained loose inside the system. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing what happened next, in the spaces between this moment and the moment when the institution finally acted. The worst part was the children who'd arrived during those 42 days, the daughters and sons of sailors and soldiers, and what Whitfield would do with them. The next morning, Rachel Torres walked through the main entrance of Cedar Creek Medical at 0800, her discharge paperwork folded in her jacket pocket, her hospital badge already surrendered to security. The badge had been warm when she'd turned it over, still carrying her body heat, still bearing the laminated photo of her temp nursing credentials that had hidden her real identity for 6 months. She'd done the math, 147 combat saves across 3 continents, and somehow this child's life had become the one she couldn't protect through channels, through protocol, through silence. The television in the lobby played CNN on mute. Red crawl at the bottom of the screen. She read it twice to make sure her eyes weren't deceiving her. Missing, decorated Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel and Torres, Naval Intelligence Operations, last seen Savannah, Georgia, classified assignment, civilian authorities requested to report any sightings to Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her photograph filled the screen, official Navy portrait, dress whites, Master Chief insignia visible, eyes that had seen Tikrit and Fallujah and a dozen locations still classified. The same eyes that had watched 7 doctors miss what a decorated SEAL commander's daughter was actually dying from. Rachel didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stood there in the lobby where she'd walked past Whitfield's office for 147 shifts, where she'd folded herself smaller each day, where she'd pressed her jaw so tight she thought it might crack. The security guard, name tag reading Mercer, U.S. Army 1991 to 1995, looked from the television to Rachel's face. Then back to the television. Then directly into her eyes. His voice came out thin. "Master Chief." Before she could answer, before she could even draw the breath to lie or refuse, the main doors opened and 2 officers in Navy dress blues entered, followed by a 2-star admiral whose shoulders moved like a man carrying the weight of command into every room he entered. The admiral was reading from a folder, his voice steady and ceremonial the way only flag officers can make official words sound like prayer. 3 Navy crosses. He paused. Folded the page back. 5 bronze stars. Another pause, longer this time. 147 combat saves including the extraction of then-Lieutenant Blake Morrison from a Tikrit ambush in 2004. The admiral looked directly at Rachel. "Master Chief Torres, you are no longer classified as missing. You are officially commended for actions taken in medical emergency at Cedar Creek Medical on the 12th of November, 2023, actions that saved the life of Commander Blake Morrison's daughter Emma Morrison, age 8. The lobby doors opened again. Commander Blake Morrison stepped through in dress white so crisp they reflected the fluorescent light like polished steel, Emma at her side wearing a yellow sundress, the girl's color healthy, her hair grown back, the weight returned to her frame in the way that meant the correct diagnosis had finally come through. The lymphoma treatment had started 48 hours after Rachel's pericardiocentesis. 48 hours to identify what for months of Whitfield's unnecessary testing had concealed. Commander Morrison walked to the center of the lobby and spoke so the entire staff could hear, so the security cameras could record every word, so the history books would know exactly what Rachel Torres had done by breaking protocol. "Master Chief Torres took shrapnel meant for me in Tikrit and carried me 4 kilometers with a collapsed lung." Morrison's voice didn't waver. Didn't break. Sounded like someone reciting debt and honor in the same breath. "She's the reason I live to have my daughter, and the reason my daughter is alive today." The room held 10 seconds of absolute silence. The kind of silence that only comes when institutions recognize they were wrong, when systems admit they failed, when 7 doctors and 1 department chair with the arrogance of tenure stand exposed in their failure. Then the FBI agents appeared at the secondary entrance, federal credentials already visible, and they moved directly toward Whitfield's administrative offices with the kind of purposeful walk that meant the forensic evidence had already been compiled, the charges already approved, the arrest already signed for. The agents didn't have to search for him. He appeared on the 3rd floor landing looking confused, looking like a man who thought his power was still institutional, still protected by tenure and medical school networks and a hospital board president who was his roommate from 30 years ago. They cuffed him in full view of the staff. His hands went behind his back without resistance, his face processing the moment where authority became liability, where connections became evidence, where 17 forged patient files and $2.3 million in fraudulent claims against military families somehow caught up with him all at once. The federal agent read him his rights while escorting him down the stairs. His face looked almost small, like a man aging backward in real time, like someone realizing that his position had never actually protected him, it had only delayed this moment. They led him toward the exit and he saw Rachel standing there, saw the Admiral beside her, saw Commander Morrison holding her daughter's healthy hand, and understood in that instant that the arrest warrant existed because a temp nurse had been better than his 7 specialists, because her composure under humiliation had meant she could move with the precision of someone trained to function under fire, because his public mockery had taught her that he would never respect her anyway, so why not? Save the child instead of saving her career. 2 uniformed officers processed Whitfield at the hospital security desk, documenting his personal effects, medical license, hospital credentials, the engraved pen the hospital had given him for 15 years of service. Each item catalogued. Each symbol of authority removed like skin being shed. The hospital board president watched from the administrative wing, phone already pressed to his ear, already making calls that would shape the next 48 hours of Cedar Creek Medical's exposure to liability, already calculating the settlements that would come before any trial. The forensic analysis was devastating because it was thorough. 17 patient files showing altered timestamps. For months of unnecessary diagnostic testing on Emma Morrison specifically designed to delay treatment while maximizing TRICARE reimbursement. The original imaging studies showing superior vena cava syndrome on day 30, clearly visible, marked as pending physician review until day 94, when Rachel's emergency intervention and correct diagnosis made any further Whitfield treatment impossible. The pattern wasn't incompetence. It was calculation. By 1,000 hours, the state medical board had suspended his license pending criminal trial. By 1400, he was formally charged with fraud, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy to defraud federal insurance programs. The news networks had already positioned cameras outside Cedar Creek's main entrance. Someone at Naval Intelligence had tipped the media, someone who understood that public accountability moved faster than institutional protection ever could. Rachel suspected Admiral Reeves, who was the kind of flag officer who believed consequences should be visible so that other doctors would see them and choose differently next time. Rachel filed her after-action report at Naval Intelligence Command Center, upstairs from where she now stood, documenting 127 days of surveillance, the mission parameters that had required her silence, the moment she calculated that blowing her cover and saving a child's life was worth losing the fraud case documentation. The choice she made when 7 doctors and 1 arrogant department chair proved they would rather maintain institutional authority than admit error. Her handler marked the report mission success, subject prosecution secured, fraud network dismantled. 3 other physicians were arrested within 48 hours. The network that targeted military families had generated $2.3 million in false claims across 18 months. The system that protected Whitfield's authority had also concealed his conspiracy until a temp nurse with combat medic training and 20 years of battlefield triage experience recognized what 7 specialists had missed. Commander Morrison provided victim testimony to the FBI, describing Emma's deteriorating condition, cataloging each test Whitfield had ordered, each diagnosis delayed, each day her daughter grew weaker while the infection built inside her pericardium. Her statement was clinical and devastating. Whitfield had ordered CT scans, ultrasounds, and specialist consultations that cost her family nothing but time the child didn't have, time that almost became fatal. The hospital settled with 7 affected families within a week. Cedar Creek's chief of medicine, who had enabled Whitfield's authority and dismissed Rachel's clinical observations, quietly retired at 58. The Department of Pediatrics underwent an external audit. The hospital hired 2 additional attending physicians with military medicine backgrounds. The policy for second opinion requests on pediatric cases was restructured. Institutional change moved faster than justice, but it moved. Rachel walked to her locker at 1,600 hours, changed back into her own clothes, and left Cedar Creek Medical with her discharge papers in her jacket pocket. She didn't say goodbye. Some departures didn't warrant speeches. She just walked out the same way she'd come in, invisible, efficient, carrying the weight of the child she'd saved and the institution that had failed her. 2 years later, Rachel Torres walked past Cedar Creek Medical's community college annex at 0800 on a Tuesday, her route to the Naval Intelligence field office now permanent assignment after the Whitfield case had made her surveillance methodology required training for all medical fraud investigations. The sunrise cut through the annex windows at an angle that illuminated the classroom perfectly, and through the glass Rachel could see Dr. James Whitfield demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy, his hands pressing rhythmically against the mannequin's sternum, teaching basic life support certification to students who had no idea they were learning from a man who had once calculated whether keeping a child alive was worth the insurance reimbursement. He wore a generic college polo shirt. His credentials hung from a lanyard that read, Instructor, Continuing Education. 5 years probation. Medical license permanently revoked. Restitution payments that would require him to work for 30 years just to balance what he'd taken. Rachel watched him count compressions aloud, 1, 2, 3, and recognized the cadence, the precision, the muscle memory he was sharing with a classroom of students. He looked up, sensed her presence the way people do when they're being observed, and met her eyes through the glass for exactly 3 seconds before looking away first. Rachel continued upstairs to her office where Emma Morrison's photo hung on the citation wall beside that tarnished challenge coin, finally displayed in the open under glass with a placard, Tickret 2004, I owe you everything. Commander Morrison had brought Emma by last month, the girl healthy and cancer-free, her hair long again, her laugh the sound of someone who'd been given a second life, to present Rachel with a new challenge coin that said, Cedar Creek 2023, now we're even. The 2 coins sat side by side in a display case. 20 years between them. 2 generations of debt and honor. The first coin, dented and worn, given by a grateful mother whose daughter Rachel had carried to safety. The second coin, pristine, from that daughter's daughter, marking the day Rachel had carried her back from the edge of a misdiagnosis, back from 7 doctors' failure, back to her life. Rachel's hand pressed against the glass, and through it she could feel both coins, both moments, both debts. Her new assignment began Monday, embedded surveillance at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth, investigating potential fraud in combat injury treatment protocols. 6 months deep cover. Nursing credentials maintained. Report only to Naval Intelligence. Her handler had sent the brief over encrypted channels. The military healthcare system trusts the process, not the people. Find the people abusing that trust. Rachel touched both challenge coins through the glass and held there for a moment, thinking about Emma Morrison learning to play soccer again, about Whitfield teaching CPR fundamentals he once performed with careless authority, about the weight of invisible service, about the cost of staying silent and the cost of breaking protocol, about 7 doctors and the 1 person they'd overlooked. She arrived at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth at 0600 on Monday in fresh scrubs with her nursing credentials and her Master Chief insignia back in a locker, waiting. The first shift started at 0700. Her handler would brief her on the target physicians by 0830. The mission parameters required her to be small, to be quiet, to be the person nobody noticed until it was time to save a life. Some missions require you to be invisible so others can survive. Rachel Torres had learned this in Tickret. She was learning it still, learning it again, because the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story about the heroes you've overlooked, the quiet people who move through our hospitals and our military, changing lives when nobody's watching. Share this story with someone you know in healthcare, someone who understands the weight of staying silent when lives depend on speaking up. Drop a comment. What would you have done in Rachel's position? Did you know that whistleblowers in healthcare can expose dangerous patterns? Leave your thoughts below, and thanks for watching.